Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English B, and our objective now for the hour is to have some converse with the texts that we have not yet covered by Wordsworth out of your hymnal. I'm first on page 786, 787, and then I'll be on page 791. We're going to address now Wordsworth as political thinker. Okay? Wordsworth as political thinker. We thought of Wordsworth in regards to his romanticism, specifically to issues of youth, old age, right? And the fact that when we're young, we have a certain way of seeing the world that changes, and we take on those elevated thoughts. We've talked about Wordsworth in regards to his views of economics. The world is too much with us late and soon, getting and spending. We waste our powers. It's not so much that Wordsworth is opposed to the mall, but rather he's opposed to the fact that the mall begins to matter more than the world of nature, right? That's for Wordsworth is the problem. Now we're going to turn to Wordsworth, the politician, or the voice of critique about political issues, okay? And to help us here, I'm on 786 with you. Read with me the background information at the top of that page. This information will help you to understand the lines that we'll be studying from the Prelude, as it's called. I'm on 786 with you. 1790, that's an important date, so you want to write that one down in your annotations. 1790, Wordsworth will witness the early optimistic days of the French Revolution. So you want to write that down. Wordsworth, along with lots of people in England, are very excited about the French Revolution. Okay? In the early days of the Revolution, very excited about the kinds of possibilities that French Revolution is going to maybe suggest, right? But, all right, we'll get to that. The country seemed on the verge of achieving true freedom from outdated oppressive feudal institutions. Caught up in the revolutionary fervor, Wordsworth felt he was seeing, quote, France standing on the top of golden hours, end quote. The war between England and France, which is declared some 3 years later in 1793, and the violent turn taken by the French Revolution, known of course as the Reign of Terror, from 93 to 94, dashed all of Wordsworth's hopes. So let's say it out loud. The two poems that we're now going to look at from the Prelude and in London, both of these poems are going to address this issue of Wordsworth's loss of political idealism and hope. Okay? Now, we in our own country at different times have witnessed this same kind of loss of optimism or loss of hope. So, for example, a certain political leader sometimes will be voted into office, and lots of people are really excited about how everything is going to be so much better and so much greater, whatever. And then the realities of politics kind of kick in, and things don't always end up the way that everyone hopes. Wordsworth then will be looking here in this poem to kind of speak about maybe some of the more negative sides, not the optimistic sides of life, but the more negative sides. As we read, and we're going to listen now to a reading of this poem in a second. As we read, I'd like you to pay attention to the places in this poem where hope is lost. The places in this poem where hope is lost. You can kind of see your little picture on 787, notice. We've got some picture here about the violence of war and the ways in which sad things are happening between England and France. Lots of hope, and then all of a sudden it's kind of starting to be lost. So here we go, the lines from the Prelude. All I want you to do is to read along and jot down in your notes the moments where hope seems to be kind of lost. In other words, things for Wordsworth do not look so good, all right? Here we go. Just follow along. Again, we're getting ready for our exam as well.
By William Wordsworth. O pleasant exercise of hope and joy, for mighty were the auxiliars which then stood upon our side, us who were strong in love. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country and romance. When reason seemed the most to assert her rights, when most intent on making of herself a prime enchantress, to assist the work which then was going forward in her name. Not favored spots alone, but the whole earth, the beauty war of promise, that which sets, as at some moments might not be unfelt among the bowers of paradise itself, the budding rose above the rose full blown. What temper of the prospect did not wake to happiness unthought of? The inert were roused, and lively natures rapt away. They who had fed their childhood upon dreams, the playfellows of fancy, who had made all powers of swiftness, subtlety, and strength their ministers, who in lordly wise had stirred among the grandest objects of the sense, and dealt with whatsoever they found there, as if they had within some lurking right to wield it, they too, who of gentle mood had watched all gentle motions, and to these had fitted their own thoughts, schemers more mild, and in the region of their peaceful selves, now was it that both found, the meek and lofty, did both find helpers to their heart's desire, and stuff at hand, plastic as they could wish, were called upon to exercise their skill, not in utopia, subterranean fields, or some secreted island, heaven knows where, but in the very world, which is the world of all of us, the place where in the end we find our happiness or not at all. But now become oppressors in their turn, Frenchmen had changed a war of self-defense for one of conquest, losing sight of all which they had struggled for, now mounted up openly in the eye of earth and heaven the scale of liberty. I read her doom with anger vexed, with disappointment sore, but not dismayed, nor taking to the shame of a false prophet. While resentment rose, striving to hide what naught could heal, the wounds of mortified presumption, I adhered more firmly to old tenets, and to prove their temper, strained them more, and thus, in heat of contest, did opinions every day grow into consequence, till round my mind they clung, as if they were its life, nay more, the very being of the immortal soul. I summoned my best skill, and toiled intent to anatomize the frame of social life, yea, the whole body of society searched to its heart. Share with me, friend, the wish that some dramatic tale, endued with shapes livelier, and flinging out less guarded words than suit the work we fashion, might set forth what then I learned, or think I learned, of truth, and the errors into which I fell, betrayed by present objects, and by reasonings false from their beginnings, inasmuch as drawn out of a heart that had been turned aside from nature's way by outward accidents, and which are thus confounded, more and more misguided and misguiding. So I fared, dragging all precepts, judgments, maxims, creeds, like culprits to the bar, calling the mind suspiciously to establish in plain day her titles and her honors, now believing, now disbelieving, endlessly perplexed with impulse, motive, right and wrong, the ground of obligation, what the rule and whence the sanction, till demanding formal proof and seeking it in everything, I lost all feeling of conviction, and in fine, sick, wearied out with contrarieties, yielded up moral questions in despair.
So let's take a look now at this poem as an example of what it means to lose in some ways your idealism, your political idealism, the ways in which you can start out thinking things are so great But then stuff shifts and things change, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm kind of unhappy. That's one way we're going to look at this poem. Another way we're going to look at this poem is to ask this question: what's the value of studying history? Like, really? So we take these classes that we call history, right? Where we learn about all this junk that happened at some point in time. What's the point of all of that, really? And it's interesting to me the number of seniors who finish now their career, school career. And it's kind of difficult for them to come up with a legitimate answer. Why did you have to study so many times the stuff of the past? What is the point of all of that study? I mean, really? It's all gone. It's all dead. It's all past. So why do we have to learn all that garbage anyway? We'll try and see if this poem enlightens us at all. There is clearly a dialectic or a tension in this poem between what two things? Write it down. Wordsworth is clearly going to play the game of some opposites or some tensions that are occurring. What are those tensions? Tensions between what? His hope about what? In regards to this poem. What was he so hopeful about? He and lots of people were very hopeful about what? This revolution in France. Everything's going to be so much better than it was before. The hope. Well, that's tension with what? What might we say? Yeah, the reality, right? The reality. The facts on the ground. The reign of terror of that year from 93 to 94. Terrible. You probably heard about it in your class, right? They just started dragging people by the hundreds up onto that scaffolding and just cutting off their heads. And mob rule prevailed. And all kinds of insanity followed, right? Lots and lots of innocent people got jacked. And Wordsworth had the expectation that this revolution was going to in some way advance the causes that he thought were noble. But yeah, not so much. In other words, we move from idealism to realism. Idealism, the way we kind of hope things are going to be, to realism. Notice the first part of our reading on page 786 is going to tell about how they were young in heart. They were so expectant of what this revolution would mean. But then notice there comes a pause. Do you see it on 787? And the word now. Do you read it? But now. Become oppressors in their turn. Frenchmen had changed a war of self-defense for one of conquest, losing sight of all which they had struggled for. Now these lines will become later in the 20th century. You can believe this, right? Because you know a little bit about the history of the 20th century. How many people die in the 20th century because of these great wars of revolution? You can jot down really quickly, can't you, at 3B, any number of examples from history of the 20th century of how this kind of thing happened. Some of the major revolutions, we think of those major Marxist revolutions, don't we? We think of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, don't we? And of course the rise of Stalin. In China, we think of course of the Communist Revolution and the rise of Mao Zedong. And in every one of these cases, guess what? These revolutions are political and they're intended to free people, but guess what? Lots and lots of people, what? They do. They get seriously jacked. Yes. In other words, what starts out as so hopeful, right, as everything's going to be so great, leads to not so much. Not so much. Now, you can obviously think about then Wordsworth's response to that. What to do. Notice he's living with, on page 787, he's living with disappointments. He's living with anger. He's living trying not to be dismayed. What to do. Top of 788. Now this is interesting. Wordsworth seems to be suggesting there is a reason to study history. Okay? There is a reason to study history. Wordsworth will in many ways begin to sound more like, we might say, less of an idealist and more of a realist as he looks at the events of the Revolution, the French Revolution. Notice he says that he is going to try to learn from history. Notice on page 788, I summoned my best skills and toiled intent to atomize the frame of social life. Try and figure it out. Now this is interesting, and I'll stop now and I'll say this out loud to my seniors. It is interesting to me how in the years to come now, you are going to move from being a kid who could care less about politics into adulthood, where all of a sudden what goes on politically will begin to matter. Jot down why at 3B that may be the case. Why is that the case? Many of you will report, dude, I couldn't tell you anything about politics right now. Don't know, don't care. Don't need to know, don't need to care. Now, one or two of us who follow politics will say, well, that's a pretty blind view. But let's be fair. It probably is the view of most of us, right? I mean, let's just be fair. Why is it that as high school seniors, we don't really have to care very much about politics? We should say national politics. We are very much in tune with politics. Politics just simply means the negotiations between people. We know all about the politics of Orland High. So, for example, if I were to say at Orland High, no one ever gossips about other people, no one ever gets into other people's business, you would immediately laugh because you would know I'm speaking ironically. In other words, there is politics that you're familiar with. It's just the politics of your class, your school, your ball club, your team, whatever that is. But I'm talking now about the politics that we would call national and then even international. Why do you think it's the case that I'm going to argue that stuff starts to matter more as you get older? Why? Can you give me specific reasons why that would be the case? How about it, Mr. Kroger? Why would all of a sudden as you get older it starts to matter? I mean, even if, for example, you kind of care about it now, you're going to care about it a lot more when you're 40, but why?
Because it affects you.
In what way does it affect you?
Like,
how specifically does it affect you?
money-wise?
Yeah, that's the fundamental truth, right? So, for example, once you start realizing that you have to pay taxes, right, on the income that you earn, all of a sudden what happens to those taxes and the decisions and the policies that are made, it starts to affect you in a different way. And then all of a sudden, you begin to do this very word. Atomize means to break down and start thinking about. What are the implications? And he says, I went from a very emotional state about the French Revolution and its failures, both being very giddy and happy and then very kind of worried about it, to becoming more inspectional. I wanted to look at it. Less emotional and more rational. Well, what specifically are the kinds of things that I can learn? And then notice he continues here. He says, share with me, friend. It's almost as if he's writing to you. The wish that some dramatic tale endured with shapes livelier and flinging out less guarded words than suit the work we fashion might set forth. What then I learned, or think I learned, of truth, and the errors into which I fell, betrayed by present objects and by reasonings false from the beginnings, inasmuch as drawn out of a heart that had been turned aside from nature's way. Now this is interesting. It's almost as if Wordsworth seems to suggest that his love of politics had kind of imbalanced him a little bit and taken him away from the stuff that really matters. And in the process now he's kind of coming back with a different view. Now he's going to study history differently. Let's jot down a 3A observation. The great Harvard philosopher Santayana said, those who forget the past are damned to repeat it. Now that's an interesting line. Those who forget the past are damned to repeat it. Of course, what Santayana didn't say is, what about those who remember the past? Can they keep from repeating it? What is the value of studying history? Well, one argument that's presented in this poem is, if you look at the events of the past, you can try to learn from those events. But now becomes the difficult question. And I'll ask it, and you can write it down, and it's one more of these kind of questions that I like to ask you that make you maybe have to think about it much later in your life. How do you study history without becoming darkly skeptical about human beings? How do you study history and still have any hope that people really, in the end, can figure stuff out and be good and live well. Because so much of history is about what? The good or the bad? A lot of the ugly, huh? A lot of the ugly, a lot of the bad, right? And so the question is, how can you look at history and still have any sense of hope? Maybe this is why young people don't spend much time caring about history. And as we get older, we have a tendency to become less idealistic. We become more entrenched in our thinking. And in the process, of course, we have to come to terms with some really nasty stuff that's happened over time. Let's continue now, and we'll look at the second of our two poems by Wordsworth that we want to pay attention to. And this becomes now kind of a critique in some ways of England and the English people. I should first point out that this poem, London 1802, is written after Wordsworth comes back from a brief visit to France. So that's the first thing that you want to write down. He actually saw some of the collateral damage of what happened in the French Revolution, and then he comes back to London. The contrast here in this poem is going to be between what Wordsworth called the vanity and parade of London life with the desolation after the revolution in France. He saw London and the English people as uncaring about all the insanity that was happening in France. And they were kind of what we would call self-absorbed. They were kind of totally into their own world. In other words, it doesn't matter what's happening in France as long as we are happy and as long as we're taken care of. The falseness of the English people leading to kind of spiritual isolation, we might say. We don't care what happens everywhere else as long as everything is okay where we live. And so he sat down and wrote this poem. In other words, this is not an optimistic poem either. This is not a happy poem. So we want to point that out for your notes right away. You don't read this poem and go, yay or yippee. This is not my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky kind of poem. Not at all. I'm trying to show you the range of Wordsworth's voice. He goes all over the place. He can write Tintern Abbey. He can write my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. But he can also write the Preludes, and he can write a poem like this one. Okay? This is more critical of his culture. Of course, look on the effacing page at 790, a poem we've already spent some time with. The world is too much with us late and soon. In other words, now again, he is critiquing his own culture. And poets often will do this. Critique their own culture, critique their own time. Let's take a look at what he says. London, 1802. He begins with a name that we're somewhat familiar with. Milton, of course, the great English poet of roughly 200 years prior, is going to be the author of what text for your notes at 3A? Milton wrote what? The famous poem was called what? Do you remember it? Milton wrote a famous poem where he sought to justify the ways of God to man in Paradise Lost. Very good. Right, Paradise Lost, remember? So that's John Milton. So he's going to begin with Milton. By the way, Milton sometimes is referenced as the greatest of the English poets, and Wordsworth certainly saw him that way. Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. I wish you were here. England hath need of thee. She is a fen of stagnant waters. Good or bad? Stagnant. Bad. Altar, sword, and pen, fireside, the heroic wealth of hale and bower, have forfeited their ancient English dower of inward happiness. Whoa, this sounds very much like the world is too much with us. In other words, English people are no longer happy on the inside, right? We are selfish men. Oh, raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. Then he speaks back to Milton again. Thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart. Thou hast a voice whose sound was like the sea, pure as the naked heavens, majestic, free. So didst thou travel on life's common way, in cheerful godliness, and yet thy heart the lowliest duties on herself did lay. So let's point out something he says about Milton. You were the greatest of our poets, and yet you spoke right to where we were, right to what we needed at the time. Where are you now? Now, this is not an unusual lament at 3A. You are maybe familiar with a couple who sang in American folk music in the 20th century called Simon and Garfunkel. And they wrote a famous song called Mrs. Robinson, where in the song the lines are, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you. What's that you say, Mrs. Robinson? Jolting Joe has left and gone away." The point I want to make here is that Wordsworth is playing an interesting game. He's going to this notion that England is already starting its decline. That's important that you write this down. That England is starting a decline. That England had been great in 1600, but now 200 years later, England is beginning to decline. What's ironic about that is that England is, of course, at its height, at its power, technologically speaking, by 1800. But Wordsworth says something is missing. Notice he says we are what? What does he call us? Selfish men. What does that mean to be selfish? We're only interested in what? Stuff about ourselves. Stuff that matters to us. We are not interested in stuff that matters around the world or in France in this case. In other words, we need the voice of Milton to try to bring us back. Jot down in your notes at 3A or 3B. Do you remember in American history a time when America knew that lots and lots of terrible things were happening around the world, but they did not want to get involved? Do you remember that time? That isolationism? The war was already happening, and American citizens were not interested until what one event? What one event? You're right, Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor did what to Americans? It did, didn't it? It kind of woke us up. In other words, whoa. Of course, lots of people had been dying. Let's be fair. The Japanese had been killing a lot of people before Pearl Harbor. And let's be clear. Americans and American citizens knew about all of this. But guess what? It was on the other side of the Pacific. Right? We don't need to worry about it. And then all of a sudden, Pearl Harbor happens. Some of you know your history by watching film, don't you? And so you've probably seen the film Pearl Harbor. And so you're familiar with that notion that, oh yeah, that was bad news when that happened. And then all of a sudden, America has to go and get involved. Wordsworth will play a similar kind of game, saying to his English people, we need to wake up politically, we need to wake up spiritually. Interestingly, he references Milton. Now this is the second time we've heard a romantic writer reference Milton. Who is the other? We read a novel. That's a romantic novel. Yes, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. You'll remember that the monster learns how to read by reading Milton's... Wait a minute. What is Milton's title of his poem? Paradise Lost, right? So Wordsworth's going to say, you know, in the same way that Adam and Eve kind of lost Eden or paradise, England is starting to lose its innocence to some degree. We are becoming less and less a good people, a compassionate people, and increasingly he calls it, selfish people. All we're interested in politically is our own stuff, our own interests or whatever. So, there you go, an introduction to Wordsworth. You now have a really important Generation 1 poet. You have a few poems under your belt, right? As we get ready to do a little bit of a review or an example.